Hello and welcome to the new series, Conversations at the Intersection of Cutting Edge Science and Spirituality, with Dr. Deepak Chopra, Jennifer Hill hosting, and Professor Don Hoffman. I'm Amanda Masters, co-founder, owner, and CEO of Awake TV Network. I invite you to check out awaketvnetwork.live, where we host many videos and documentaries on science and spirituality, health and wellness, and many other modalities here to support you during these times. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us here at Awake TV Network. I'm your host, Jennifer Hill, and I'm so happy to have you here with us for the ongoing conversation that we get to engage in with Dr. Deepak Chopra and Professor Don Hoffman. Today, we are calling the show Conversations at the Intersection of Cutting-Edge Science and Spirituality. And when this series was first birthed back in January of this year, it began by trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. We began exploring this by looking into both Dr. Deepak Chopra's book, Metahuman, and Professor Don Hoffman's book, A Case Against Reality. So before we jump into today's scientific and spiritual debate, I'd love to introduce you to our very esteemed guests that we have with us here today. We have Dr. Deepak Chopra, who has authored 90 books, with his 91st book on the way, being released later this year in September. He is the founder of the Chopra Foundation, which is a nonprofit entity for research on well-being and humanitarianism, as well as Chopra Global, an organization at the intersection of science and spirituality. Dr. Deepak Chopra is a world-renowned pioneer in integrative medicine, as well as personal transformation. And with us today, we have as well Don D. Hoffman. Donald D. Hoffman received his PhD from MIT and is a professor in the cognitive sciences at University of California, Irvine. He has written 120 scientific papers and 3 books, including his most recent book, which I'm sure we'll talk about again today, A Case Against Reality. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
So guys, I mean, there's so many ways that we could take this conversation today. If you've been with us on this journey for the last 2 episodes, put your thinking cap on and prepare to hit rewind, because there are so many gems that Deepak and Don, I'm sure, will be sharing with us today. But I think the question that we want to start off today's scientific and spiritual conversation about is, what is the universe made of? Deepak, do you want to start off with that one today?
You're asking me or Dr. Hoffman?
Well, we'll start with you. I think we're going to reverse.
Okay.
Started last week.
Currently, the current scientific view is that approximately 70% of the universe is something called dark energy. We actually don't know what it is. It's the opposite of gravity. So dark energy is given the credit for the expanding universe. And what is expanding faster than the speed of light is the space between galaxies. And we don't know what the reason is. There are many theories, cosmological constant, etc., but the fact is we do not actually know what dark energy is. So that leaves about 30% of the universe remaining, and of that, apparently, 26% is another entity that's referred to as dark matter. And the reason it's called dark matter is it's not observable. And the reason it's not observable is it's supposedly not atomic. The name given for the particles of dark matter is WIMPs, weakly interactive massive particles. But nobody has ever observed these particles. We humans are made of atoms, which means we interact with light. And if something is not made of atoms, then theoretically it's actually even not available to human perception or to any perception that uses light as an interface. Of course, there are experiments now happening underground to look for this mysterious substance, which may be a weakly interactive massive particle, which means it may be detectable. So now we're left with 4% of the universe, which is atomic. Now here's the interesting thing. 99.99% of the atomic universe is invisible interstellar dust, which means, and they think it's, most people think it's hydrogen or helium, but it's not observable. So the visible universe, which now we are told is 2 trillion galaxies, 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable trillions of planets. Some of them may be habitable because they have a biosphere similar to ours. We don't know. But the visible universe with all that is 0.01% of what exists there. And we have a problem even with that, because the visible universe, that is all this stuff, is made of atoms, which are made of particles, and particles have this dual nature. Unobserved particles are supposed to be waves of probability. And when you ask scientists, where do these waves of probability exist? The response I get, I'll see what Don has to say. The response I get is they exist in Hilbert space. So I say, well, what is Hilbert space? And they describe a multi-dimensional infinite space or zero-dimensional infinite space with infinite possibilities. In fact, the current theories in science are positing infinite universes, multi-worlds. And so all these exist in Hilbert space. But where is it? It's a mathematical construct. So the short answer is, what's the universe made of? It seems to be made of nothing. Now the question is, what is the nature of this nothingness? Is it just an empty void, or is it the womb of creation? I'll leave it right there for Don.
Oh, that's a very good overview, Deepak. So another aspect of this that's, I think, of interest is the notion of space and time and space-time. For centuries, scientists have assumed that space and time was fundamental, and then in the last 100 years, the union of space and time into one structure called space-time, since the work of Einstein. And so for centuries, at least since Newton, but really before Newton, scientists have thought of space and time, or space-time, as the fundamental bedrock of reality. And microphysical particles, such as quarks and gluons, are irreducible representations. They're representations of symmetries of space-time. So space-time has this structure, and we can model that structure, and what we call particles are representations of the symmetrical aspect of the structure of space-time. And now, in the last few decades, physicists have begun to realize that our best physical theories, general relativity and quantum field theory, together, are telling us that space-time cannot be the fundamental nature of reality. So, and that's the power of scientific theories. They can, that's why we do mathematical theories, is because the theories become so precise that they can tell us where they stop. They can tell us where they fail. In general relativity, we get signs of failure where we get infinities. We get singularities, for example, at the center of black holes and so forth. And we get singularities when we try to make measurements at smaller and smaller scales, when we bring quantum mechanics and gravity together. And so quantum field theory and general relativity are together telling us that space-time is doomed. And that's not my phrase. That's a phrase that's been said by very famous physicists and mathematicians like Nima Arkani Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Ed Witten, also at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, David Gross. They're recognizing, and there's a book that's just coming out in a couple days called Beyond Spacetime. It's the book by physicists coming out in June 25th, I think Cambridge University Press, Beyond Spacetime. And it's technical, but the physicists are realizing that space-time has had a good run. We thought it was the fundamental reality, and that's over. And our best theories are telling us it's over. And the work that I've been doing with my colleagues on evolution by natural selection also says it's over. So evolution by natural selection agrees with general relativity and quantum field theory that space-time cannot be fundamental. If there is anything fundamental, it's not space-time, it's something beyond space-time. And for the young scientists, this is not a problem. This is fun, because it means there's an opportunity for fantastic discovery. And so the best and brightest young minds are eager to explore what's beyond space-time. And right now they're using mathematics, the mathematics of general relativity and quantum field theory and symmetries that they find there as like a flashlight into the dark, beyond space-time, what's out there. And they don't know, but they're using mathematics, which is a really good way for scientists to go. They're using mathematics to try to see structures about a deeper reality that goes deeper than space-time, and they're discovering stuff. They're discovering symmetries that are in the real data, like the data that you get from the Large Hadron Collider when you smash gluons together and see what sprays out. When you look at that data, there are symmetries in the data, the dual conformal symmetries that can't be expressed in space-time. And when you force yourself to try to compute the probabilities of these scattering events in space-time, you get hundreds or even thousands of pages of math. But they've discovered if you let go of space-time, the math becomes trivial. You can compute it by hand on the back of an envelope. 1,000 pages becomes something you can compute by hand. So there are big, big hints which is opening up a real world of exploration for the younger generation. There's symmetries beyond space-time, and the math becomes real easy, but what is it about? So they're exploring the math, but they don't know what it's about. So my view is that ultimately, I would like to show that a mathematical model of consciousness can give rise to these deeper structures that they're finding, the symmetries and the simple mathematical, geometrical there's geometrical structures they're finding, something called the amplituhedron and positroids and motives and so forth. These are very interesting structures that I think a theory of consciousness, when we look at the long-term behavior of a network of conscious agents, like a big social network of conscious agents, and look at the asymptotic behavior, the long-term behavior, that there'll be a clean mapping between that long-term behavior and the structures that they're finding. So ultimately, I think consciousness is, from a scientific point of view, consciousness will be seen to be fundamental. And what physics has been doing is discovering, not seeing the step-by-step action of consciousness, but seeing, like from a helicopter point of view, way, way high up. It's like if you're looking at the traffic on the freeway from way, way up, you can't see that there's all sorts of individual people thinking about what they're doing and turning the wheels and so forth. All these consciousnesses inside the cars that are driving them. You're just up there. It looks like a bunch of particles. It looks like fluid dynamics or something that you could just write hydrodynamic equations for or something like that. So you just see it from a very, very high level and you give statistics. That's what physics has been doing. And it's great. No complaint about that. It's wonderful. But now when we get down to the individuals inside the cars, that now we're not just looking at statistics of the population, we're looking at individuals. That's the next scientific theory we need, of consciousness, of individual conscious agents, and the social network of conscious agents, how they interact, and then show how the long-term behavior of that network is the beginning point of where the physics research has started, right? They've only looked at the asymptotic behavior. So that's sort of the direction that I think we'll find ultimately like a convergence of science and spirituality. We'll see that spirituality can lead to mathematically precise and testable predictions, and that the science, the standard physical science we've had so far, has been capturing only the helicopter view. But now we can get down to the individual view of the conscious agents.
So a question about that, Don, and Deepak, you're welcome to jump in here as well. Can consciousness observe consciousness, or is that not possible in the current time-space theory of how we exist?
So I can only answer that from my spiritual practice and my learnings of the wisdom traditions. And the answer is that consciousness, by its very nature, seeks to be conscious of experience. That's the definition, right? Consciousness seeks to be conscious of experience. So it self-interacts into the subject and the object of experience, the knower and the known, the seer and the scenery, the observer and the observed. But the fundamental activity of consciousness is neither the seer nor the scenery, it's just seeing. Fundamental activity of consciousness, when I'm saying seeing, I'm talking about generalizing about all perceptions, okay? Mm-hmm. So the fundamental activity of consciousness is seeing, and in every act of seeing, so I'm looking at you now and I look there, as soon as I have a perceptual snapshot of experience, I shouldn't even say I. As soon as there's a snapshot of experience, there is a seer and a scenery that is generated at that time. So when I look at you and I look at another object and I look at you again, it's a different seer and it's a different scenery. Because when I looked at you, the snapshot that I took, it's over. Okay? This is a new snapshot. And the seer and the scenery is also new. The only continuity is the presence of consciousness both in between the snapshots of experience and in the snapshots of experience. So what Don was saying, the view from the helicopter is in between the snapshots if you pay attention to the transcendent consciousness which is prior to subject-object split. Okay, and when you pay attention to that, there's total stillness, deep silence, nothing, just witnessing awareness. As soon as you interact, snapshot, then there's the seer and the scenery generated. But in reality, there's neither the seer nor the scenery. The seer and the scenery come about as a result of consciousness knowing itself as me and the other, and ultimately knowing itself as me and everything else. The passenger in the car and the view from the helicopter are basically what you might call absolute view and relative view. So the relative view is the conditioned mind, whether it's conditioned through mythology or religion or mathematics or science, whatever. It's a mode of knowing. It's not the knower. I hope that answers your question.
That's perfect, Deepak. And I actually want to throw it back to Don, because Don, I know your book, the most recent one, A Case Against Reality, and I believe it's Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. Tell us a little bit about how this perspective that we're not designed to see the truth, even these examples that you and Deepak are speaking about, helicopter and car or passenger in the car. In your book, you address the fact that this isn't even the truth of things, because speaking from an evolutionary standpoint, we weren't designed to see truth. We were designed to see fitness points. So when you begin to discuss what the universe is made of, or the consciousness and the perspective, by the very nature of our discussing it, we're not seeing the truth of that thing, except as much as we agree that mathematics can give us some semblance of something to work from, right?
That's right. And so here, evolution by natural selection actually agrees with recent developments in physics. And they also align with what Deepak was just saying, that is essentially when I look over there and I see something, I'm creating the experience of it. I look over there and I see a banana, I create that experience, and I look away and I delete that experience. Now I'm creating an experience of an apple over here. Technically, the ideas in physics, and then I'll talk about the evolution, are, the technical term are the notions of local realism and non-contextual realism. So local realism is the claim that an object like a banana or a proton has a position, a momentum, a spin. In other words, its fundamental physical properties. It has definite values of those physical properties, even when it's not observed. And that those properties have causal influences that propagate through space-time no faster than the speed of light. That's the locality part. So local realism is the claim objects exist, they have definite values of their physical properties, and those definite values, like position and momentum, have causal influences that affect other things no faster than the speed of light. That's local realism. And most of us would think, oh, well, of course, local realism is true. I mean, we're made of electrons, we're made of protons. Of course, they would exist even, you know, whether or not they're observed, they exist and they have their real properties. Well, it turns out, of course, you might ask, you know, who cares about that claim? It's just pure philosophy. How could you know what's happening when no one looks, right? How could you possibly, as a scientist, have an experiment that determines whether or not a proton has a position when no one looks? By definition, you're not looking. So clearly, this is like, one example that's been given is this is like asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's a silly question. Well, it turns out it's not a silly question. John Bell in 1963, 1964 discovered, using the mathematics of quantum theory, an inequality. There's a theorem called Bell's inequality, and he proposed a series of experiments that can test whether or not local realism is true. The experiment has been done many, many times, and the answer is clear. Local realism is false. Local realism is empirically ruled out. Now that leaves two options. Either realism is false, so it's false that an electron has a position when it's not observed, or locality is false. In other words, Einstein's claim that nothing influences faster than the speed of light is false, or both are false. But there's another notion that's important. It's called non-contextual realism. And this is the claim, again, of realism, that the electron has a position when it's not observed. And non-contextuality is the claim that the value of that parameter, like the position, doesn't depend on how you observe it. That's the context of observation. And it turns out that quantum theory is very clear. Non-contextual realism is false. So non-contextual realism is also false. So local realism is empirically false. Non-contextual realism is false. And that makes perfect sense when you realize that space-time itself is doomed. So nothing inside space-time exists fundamentally when it's not observed. It's not a fundamental reality. So my conclusion is that realism is false. Realism about particles, realism about their positions, momenta, and realism about space-time itself. Space-time and particles are data structures of our experience that we have when we look. They're part of our little species-specific user interface, as Deepak mentioned earlier. So we have this little virtual reality headset. Its structure, its format is space-time. And the pixels, if you will, are things like particles. And the things that we see are just like in virtual reality. If I'm playing a race car game in virtual reality, I look over there and I see a green, Mustang. And I look over there and I see a red Ferrari. When I see the green Mustang, I'm creating the green Mustang. There isn't a green Mustang in reality. I'm just turning my headset over there and I'm creating the Mustang in my experience. And I create the Ferrari in my experience. When I look away, I delete them. So I'm saying that everything that you see in everyday life is like that virtual reality. You create objects. Local realism is false. The Ferrari doesn't exist when you don't look at it. Neither do bananas and the sun and the moon and forks and spoons and so forth. Those things exist only when you look. And evolution by natural selection then jumps in and says, yes, it's a theorem of natural selection that whatever structure objective reality might have, the probability is zero that our perceptions will report that structure. That's the theorem that we have. The probability is zero. If our senses evolved and were shaped by natural selection, then the probability is precisely zero that the structures in the world will be reflected in the structures of the fitness payoffs which govern what we will perceive. Since the fitness payoffs don't preserve the structures of the world, there's no way that our senses could ever perceive the structures of the world. So what that means simply is space-time is doomed. Space-time has to be just our format, it's not the structure of objective reality.
So I actually have a question for Don, because this is what he said is so important, and it rests actually on one question, which I'm going to ask Don, okay?
Please, go ahead.
May I do that? May I ask?
Go for it, Deepak.
Yeah, so the question is, what do we mean when we say the observer? This is very important for me to understand, because again, through my spiritual practice and through my meditation practice, the observer is not embodied at all. So your body-mind and that which the body-mind is experiencing as the universe, they are a unified activity. So as I observe you, I have to also be generating the observation of this, because this and that go together. They're entangled as experience. Mm-hmm. So the biological organism is actually not the observer. The biological is part of the observation. And so in Vedanta, in Kashmir Shaivism, and all these what we call non-dual traditions, whatever appears on the screen of consciousness, it doesn't matter whether it's you, or it's a thought, or it's a mathematical equation, or it's an emotion, whatever appears on the screen of consciousness is the world appearance. And that includes your own physical body. That's part of the world appearance. So your physical body is not actually the observer. Your physical body is part of the observed. And the observer is non-local, that experiences itself as local through the subject-object split. The subject is the biological observer, biological local observer, and the scenery is the extension of that particular biological observer filtered through the conditioned mind. Whether it's scientifically conditioned, mathematically, doesn't matter. It's a story, it's a model. The model itself is in consciousness. Okay? All the models themselves are in consciousness. You can't have a model without consciousness. So, the consciousness therefore conceives, governs, constructs, and becomes the experience of both this local observer and this local scenery. So my question to Don is, who or what is the observer and where is it?
That's an excellent question. And for physicists, that turns out to be a real problem. In quantum theory, when they get to the point of actually making an observation, the formalism is something like a self-adjoint operator. So they write down this mathematical operator. And there are more general formalisms for it than that, but they have just this mathematical operator that will take the wave function of whatever the quantum system might be, a photon or an electron, and will then give out numbers for position, or probably it will actually give you values, and you can compute the probabilities of that you would get these various values of position, momentum, and spin. And so when they talk about an observer, they don't define an observer. They talk about an operator that gives you an outcome. Now, what's interesting is there are approaches. There's an approach to physics called quantum Bayesian Ism by Professor Chris Fuchs at Boston University. Very, very brilliant physicist. And he points out that the probabilities that are coming up in quantum mechanics are what he calls subjective probabilities. They're the degrees of belief of the experimenter about the outcomes that the experimenter will get if they do a particular experiment. So that the wave function, this quantum wave function of the electron is not some objective property of reality independent of the observer. It's instead the degrees of belief of the experimenter about what they will possibly experience if they make certain interventions in nature. But when Chris Fuchs then addresses to himself the question, well, so then you need to give me a theory of the observer that's having these subjective probabilities. And he says, I'm not going to do that. Like he can't do that. And he says, I don't owe you that. I mean, I'm just trying to tell you what quantum mechanics is. It's a manual for the observer, but what is an observer? Well, that's a separate issue, and he doesn't address it. And I was recently at an FQXI conference a few years ago in Banff on the role of the observer in physics. And I never saw a definition of an observer there. What I did notice was that they did not want to say that it was consciousness. They didn't want to start with a theory that began with consciousness. And these were among the most avant-garde. So my reading of physics right now, the state of play is, they understand that space-time is doomed. That they understand. They understand that local realism is false, non-contextual realism is false. Most of them are not willing to take seriously the idea that consciousness is fundamental. To the extent that they'll talk about consciousness, they might talk about it as a state of matter. Somehow you get special states of matter and they'll give rise to consciousness, or states of mathematics. So the question is a very, very good one. It puts a finger on a real problem that the scientists are going to have to deal with. When we're letting go of space-time, we're going to have to really get a scientist, a mathematically precise theory of the observer and how the observer generates space-time and particles. So this is where I think science and spirituality are going to really intersect in a very interesting way.
So I have a question for you, Don. What's your opinion? Is the observer local or non-local? The fundamental observer, is it local or non-local?
Completely non-local. The observer is non-local. And let me be precise by what I mean by that. So locality, when you talk about things being local, you're bringing in, of course, the notion of space and time. You're saying, in some sense, space-time is fundamental, and things exist at particular points in space-time. Hoffman is in Irvine at a particular address at this time, and so he's locally in space-time at that place and time. And so that's locality, and then the other aspect, of course, is that I'm having influences that propagate no faster than the speed of light. What I'm saying, what the physicists are saying, is that space-time itself is not fundamental. And that means that whatever is fundamental is not inside space-time, and therefore it's not local. So already they're looking for mathematical structures, like this amplituhedron and positroids and so forth, outside of space-time. So they're by definition non-local. They will then try to project these non-local things into space-time where you get a local representation. So I would say, I agree, Deepak. I as an observer, my consciousness is not local, it's not trapped in space-time. We use space-time as a convenient fiction for representing ourselves as in space-time, but that's just a simplification. That's just to get through the day and to do stuff. But fundamentally, and so what, I'm saying this as a scientist, even if I had no spiritual interests at all, just as a scientist, we have to let go of locality. It's been a wonderful, powerful concept for centuries, but it's over. And it's time for us to get a deeper concept. The deeper concept will have to project back into space-time in lawful ways. So all of the good science that we have in space-time absolutely was essential. And it's incredibly good work. And it's a boundary condition on any deeper theories that we come up with. So I'm not saying we throw away all the previous science. To the contrary, all of the hard work that we've done, we've explored our headset. We've understood our headset. Now we can understand how consciousness, which is the real thing, gets projected into our headset. That's the next step in science. How does this whole network of conscious agents project into our little space-time headset and give us the illusion of locality.
That's so beautiful. Jennifer, I think we have sequentially examined the heart problem now in 3 episodes. And the next thing is, so if what we're saying is true, particularly what Don Hoffman is saying is true, that space-time is not fundamental and the observer is non-local, what does this mean for the future of science, the future of technology, the future of human experience, and the future of everything, including how we view evolution and the ecosystems in which evolution is embedded. So I would suggest that we stop here. We've been going for almost an hour with these very difficult abstract concepts for the general public, that we put them in a sequence as a playlist. And I can guarantee you that I can put that playlist together. Oh, well, you can put the playlist, but we can then distribute the playlist on multiple platforms and ultimately maybe use it for a few scholarly articles as well. But for the moment, I think this is a great series. Just the series says, you know, conversations on the cutting edge of science and spirituality, 1, 2, 3, and we'll see how far we can go. I originally thought maybe 5 or 6, but we don't know. Let's see how far we can take this. But I don't know, Don, if you're familiar with the conversations between David Bohm and Krishnamurti. Are you?
Yes.
You are.
Yeah, yes, I've seen them, and I actually went and spoke for a weekend at the Krishnamurti Foundation in Ojai.
Okay, so did I. So that's great. I think we can create a series similar to the Bohm and Krishnamurti series, but
Cool.
now we have a lot more science than when they had the series. What do you think?
Absolutely, and I think that what you put your finger on is an important next topic is right, that this non-local nature of the observer and the letting go of space-time means that we have to rethink science itself. And how do we reconceptualize science? Because the key point, one of the key points there is that scientists have assumed that physical objects exist. There are public physical objects that we can, as scientists, all look at the same object. You can measure the position of that electron. I can measure the position of the same electron because there really is an electron there, and then we can compare notes. And so there's this notion of objectivity from public physical objects. How do we rethink science when there are no public physical objects?
So can I offer something on that, Don?
Yes.
This is very funny. I was privileged enough to get to hear Jean Houston. Are you familiar with Jean Houston at all? I think she's actually Dr. Jean Houston, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not as familiar.
A really incredible woman, and she actually met Einstein. Have you, by any chance, I doubt either one of you would have even been around when Einstein was around, but it was pretty remarkable. She shared a story yesterday in a conference that I was at, where when she was 8 years old, Einstein came to speak at her school. And so there were a couple smart aleck kids in the audience, and this one smart aleck kid put up his hand and he says, "Mr. Einstein, how can I be as smart as you?" And Einstein looks at him and he says, "Read fairy tales." And the kid's like, you know. And so then another smart aleck kid puts his hand up and says, "Mr. Einstein, how can I be smarter than you?" And he says, "Read more fairy tales." So at this point, the kids are getting kind of antsy. They're 8 years old. And Jean Houston, the woman I met yesterday, shared this question with Einstein. She said, "Mr. Einstein, what I'm hearing you say is that we should use our imagination." And Einstein said, "Yes, young lady, that is exactly right. You see, I have all these scientists below me who they work on the mathematics. And what I do is I ride on the wave of light through time and space and get to use my imagination to create what I want. And what I'm present to after today's conversation is that in order to create a new theory based on consciousness, it's going to require imagination to get us out of the space-time construct, to move beyond that, but it requires us to imagine things in a way we never have before."
Absolutely, that's wonderful, and part of it is to recognize, to imagine that this is all just a headset. It's a rookie mistake. Our species has been stuck in a rookie mistake. We thought that this headset was the truth. We just have to learn that we could take the headset off and there's a whole reality beyond the headset. It's that simple.
On a very simplistic level, Don, the wisdom tradition say if you're wearing red glasses, then the world is red, and everything you do is in the red world, period. So you've taken that to a bigger headset.
That's right. Space-time itself is the headset.
Yes. Okay, Jennifer, is that good?
This has been a really incredible conversation. And, you know, before we sign off here and give everybody waiting anticipation for this next episode in the series, I want to make sure people know where they can deep dive into some of these topics. So Deepak, I know that you just published your 90th book, Metahuman. Tell people where they can find out more information about that and about your 91st book coming up here in September.
Well, all they have to go is to deepakchopra.com, and these conversations will be part of a playlist on your channel as well as on the Chopra Well. So those places, please check them out.
Fantastic. And Don, Professor Don Hoffman, if people want to find out more information or perhaps even audit one of your classes at UCI, you were my personal professor back when I was in school about 20 years ago at UCI. And I know you were my favorite professor I ever had. Shh, don't tell anybody. But if people wanted to perhaps audit one of your classes or find out about some of these talks that you've given, where would they go to find that information out? Well,
there's my book, as you mentioned, The Case Against Reality, Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. And then also, if you just Google Donald Hoffman, Hoffman, my homepage comes up. And I have links to a lot of my publications and podcasts and so forth. Actually, I won't be teaching classes now for a few years. I'm going emeritus.
Oh, good for you. Congratulations. Well, now people have to come here and follow your
That's right. This is the place.
Well, then we have to shoot the breeze a little bit more.
That's right.
I love that, guys.
Okay.
This is so much fun. And something else I'd love to compile for all of our viewers out there is a list of reading material that is supplemental to this. I know Don and I were talking before the show, but there's so many topics here that we're barely skimming the surface on. So as we continue in this series, I would invite you both to think of some of your favorite literature, authors, teachers, professors on this, and let's begin to provide additional resources for our viewers and listeners should they want more information, because I don't know about any of you out there, but I'm definitely eager to learn more about these topics. So
great.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To have everybody here. My name is Jennifer Hill. You have been tuning in here on AwakeTVNetwork.live, and we are so thankful that you joined us here today for another episode of Conversations at the intersection of cutting edge science and spirituality. So it's been a lot of fun, and we look forward to seeing you for the next episode.